It began as a quiet tension, the sort of political pressure that builds slowly in the background until it becomes impossible to ignore. In the summer of 1941, when the world was already burning from Europe to North Africa, Iran found itself pulled into a storm it had desperately tried to avoid. Newspapers of the time reported it as a developing situation on the outskirts of the global conflict, but beneath those headlines lay a larger truth: Iran had become one of the most important pieces on the chessboard of World War II, a crossroads where fear, ambition, and geopolitics collided. What unfolded was not merely the story of a neutral nation caught between fighting powers, but a dramatic narrative of mistrust, miscalculation, and the heavy weight of geography that shapes the fate of nations more than their leaders ever intend. To understand why Britain and the Soviet Union marched into Iran in August 1941, one must look back at the rise of Reza Shah Pahlavi, a stern military figure determined to rebuild the nation and free it from the suffocating grip of foreign influence. Since the late 19th century, Iran had been treated as a zone of rivalry between Russia in the north and Britain in the south. Reza Shah wanted that to end. He imagined an Iran that stood proudly on its own feet, modern, sovereign, industrial, and no longer at the mercy of outsiders. His dream pushed him to seek partners who would not interfere politically, unlike the old colonial powers. And in the 1930s, that partner appeared to be Germany. Germany had no colonial legacy in Iran, and it brought something the Shah desperately wanted: technology, engineering, industrial know-how, and skilled workers who came not as occupiers but as experts. German engineers helped develop railways, roads, factories, and military systems. To many Iranians, Germany represented progress without domination, and the Shah welcomed them in growing numbers. But what seemed like an innocent partnership soon became a source of suspicion for both Britain and the Soviet Union, who were already watching Germany's rise with alarm. By 1940, nearly 1,000 Germans were working in Iran, some in sensitive positions. British intelligence, already stretched thin across Europe, grew increasingly worried that these Germans were more than just technicians. They claimed that spies, saboteurs, and Nazi sympathizers were embedded among them, allegations that historians still debate today. At the same time, the Soviet Union, shaken by internal fears and Stalin's constant paranoia, could not tolerate any hint of German activity near its southern border. Yet Iran insisted on neutrality, declaring it would not join any side in the war. But the war did not care about neutrality. And Iran's geography made neutrality nearly impossible. Everything changed in June 1941 when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive and brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the USSR was fighting for its survival. Britain and the United States knew that if the Soviets collapsed, the Axis powers would dominate Eurasia. Supplies had to reach the Soviet armies quickly: millions of tons of food, military vehicles, ammunition, fuel, and machinery. But getting these supplies to the USSR was a logistical nightmare. The northern Arctic route was deadly due to German submarines and freezing storms. Many ships never reached their destination. The Pacific route was complicated by Japanese movements. The only remaining viable path was through Iran, a country whose long northbound railway line and connected ports made it the perfect land bridge between the Allies and the Soviet front. This route, later called the Persian Corridor, was the lifeline the Soviets needed. But it was not yet in Allied hands. And Iran refused to expel German nationals or open its transport system to the Allies. To Reza Shah, giving in to Allied demands meant surrendering Iranian sovereignty. To the Allies, Iran's refusal meant the war could be lost. Every week that passed without supplies weakened Soviet defenses, and German armies were moving dangerously close to the Caucasus, the doorstep of Iran itself. Diplomatic notes were exchanged, warnings issued, proposals sent, and yet nothing changed. The Shah believed that standing his ground would protect Iran's dignity. But London and Moscow saw it differently. In their eyes, Iran was not just a country, it was a strategic asset that could not be allowed to fall into German hands. British oil interests in Abadan, the world's largest oil refinery at the time, were another major concern. If Germany somehow gained influence over Iran, even indirectly, it would threaten the British Empire's most precious resource, petroleum. By mid-August, the decision had been made behind closed doors. Britain and the Soviet Union would launch a joint invasion Operation Countenance. The operation was justified publicly as a necessary step to secure supply lines and eliminate German agents, though privately, both powers knew they wanted control of Iranian territory before German forces got anywhere near it. Reza Shah's neutrality was no longer an obstacle, it was a casualty of the war's ruthless logic. As military preparations intensified, Iran was still hoping diplomacy would prevail. The government believed that Britain and the Soviet Union would hesitate to invade a sovereign nation without provocation. But the Allies, driven by fear and urgency, were not willing to wait. On August 25, 1941, before dawn, British and Soviet forces launched a coordinated assault from north and south. In the north, Soviet tanks rolled across the borders of Azerbaijan. In the south, British and Indian divisions pushed through the Persian Gulf ports. Iranian resistance, brave but outmatched, quickly faltered. Its army, though modernizing, was no match for two global powers striking simultaneously. News reached Tehran slowly but shockingly. Trains halted, telegraph lines buzzed with confusion, and officials realized within hours that the invasion was not a minor border clash but a full-scale strategic takeover. Reza Shah, furious and humiliated, understood that the battle was lost before it even began. Iran's attempt to stay neutral had collapsed under the weight of global war, and the Shah's gamble aligning with Germany for modernization had backfired in the worst possible way. By early September, Allied forces controlled key cities, railways, and oil fields. The Shah was forced to abdicate, replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was seen as more manageable and less defiant. Iran was now under Anglo-Soviet occupation, not because it wanted war, but because the world's deadliest conflict had closed in from all sides, crushing its neutrality beneath the urgent needs of empires fighting for survival. The invasion, Operation Countenance, unfolds. The morning of August 25, 1941 arrived in Iran with a silence that felt deceptive, too still for a region surrounded by armies, too calm for what was about to erupt. People in border towns woke to a distant rumbling at first, the sort of vibration that unsettles animals and travels faintly through dry soil. Within minutes, that rumble sharpened into the mechanical grind of engines, the metallic shriek of armored tracks, and the unmistakable thunder of aircraft cutting across the sky. It was the sound of a foreign decision being enforced on Iranian soil. The Anglo-Soviet invasion had officially begun. In the northern reaches of the country, Soviet units streamed over the border with a force that suggested months of deliberate preparation. Columns of tanks, armored cars, and infantry pushed forward with a speed that overwhelmed border posts before most soldiers even understood what was happening. Reports trickled into local garrisons in scattered, panicked bursts, communications officers shouting about armored movement, aircraft overhead, or positions lost. The Soviets did not waste time on subtlety. They targeted the rail lines, bridges, and mountain passes that connected the Caucasus to Iranian territory, ensuring that Iranian units could not regroup or mount an effective counterattack. Further south, near the Persian Gulf, British and Indian divisions moved with equal determination. Warships forced entry into key ports, clearing the way for landing troops, while aircraft from the Royal Air Force attacked communication centers, fuel depots, and military barracks. Civilians in coastal towns saw unfamiliar uniforms and foreign vehicles rolling through streets that had never witnessed large-scale conflict. British officers issued orders through translators, instructing towns to remain calm. But calm was impossible. Iran was being overwhelmed on two fronts that were never meant to withstand simultaneous pressure. Iran's military, though improving under Reza Shah's modernization efforts, was inexperienced in dealing with such coordinated, mechanized warfare. Its air force had limited aircraft, many outdated or lacking spare parts. When British planes soared overhead, Iranian pilots who attempted to take off found themselves outclassed by faster, better armed fighters that dominated the sky within minutes. In the northern theater, Soviet aircraft strafed roads and railway lines, eliminating the possibility of a swift Iranian counteroffensive. By mid-morning, the Iranian High Command realized the situation was slipping dangerously out of control. Orders were issued for defensive regrouping, but those commands struggled to reach units that had already been cut off by disrupted telegraph lines and destroyed infrastructure. In some areas, brave but futile resistance slowed the invaders by mere minutes. A few Iranian units staged hurried defenses near key bridges, firing from sandbag walls or makeshift barricades, only to be pushed aside by overwhelming firepower. Local commanders understood they were not facing one enemy, they were facing two of the world's largest military forces acting in perfect synchronization. In Tehran, the initial reports sounded fragmented, almost unbelievable. Ministers argued over whether the attacks might be isolated incidents or border skirmishes. But as confirmations poured in, enemy troops advancing in the north, British warships offloading soldiers in the south, airfields under assault, there was no room left for doubt. Iran was at war, a war it had hoped never to join, a war that had arrived without negotiation or warning. By the afternoon, the scale of the invasion became clearer. In the northwest, Soviet forces captured Tabriz after brief clashes with local units. Residents saw red flags raised over administrative buildings and foreign officers setting up command posts in buildings normally reserved for regional officials. In the southwest, British Indian troops secured the Abadan refinery, one of the key objectives of the operation. The refinery workers were forced to halt production under armed supervision, while military engineers inspected facilities to ensure they remained intact for Allied use. Meanwhile, the railway line linking the Persian Gulf to the northern provinces, critical for the supply route that the Allies intended to use, came under strict foreign control. Engineers and soldiers worked quickly to secure trains, depots, and tunnels, knowing that logistics mattered as much as military victory. The Allies were here not to occupy for conquest, but to carve a corridor through which the war against Germany could be sustained. In the Iranian capital, confusion turned to anger, and anger turned to panic. Crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding explanations, while rumors spread faster than officials could respond. Some believed Germany would intervene. Others thought the Allies intended to partition Iran permanently. No one could fully grasp the scale of the operation or the diplomatic calculations happening behind the scenes. Reza Shah, confronted with news that his army was collapsing on multiple fronts, demanded resistance. His generals warned that resisting two major powers would only bring more destruction. Yet the Shah's pride, bruised by what he viewed as a violation of Iran's dignity, made surrender emotionally unacceptable. As a compromise, he ordered a temporary withdrawal from direct confrontation but refused to issue a full capitulation. This decision led to awkward half measures: some units withdrew, others held ground, and a few continued fighting without clear orders, leading to unnecessary casualties. The next day, Soviet and British forces pressed further inland, capturing strategic crossroads and disarming Iranian units. Civilians caught in the path of advancing columns watched quietly from windows and rooftops, uncertain whether these new arrivals were temporary or the beginning of something far more permanent. Shops closed early, markets emptied, and families stayed indoors to avoid becoming entangled in firefights that erupted sporadically in rural areas. By the third day, Tehran was effectively encircled. Though not yet occupied, the capital was within easy reach. Iranian officials negotiated frantically, but the Allies were resolute. The Shah must expel all German nationals, accept Allied military presence, and guarantee the full cooperation of Iran's transportation network. With the threat of bombardment looming and internal pressure rising, resistance became an unsustainable option. On August 29, the Iranian government announced a ceasefire. Fighting dwindled as Allied forces consolidated control over key roads, ports, and railways. Soldiers were ordered to stand down, and commanders were instructed to avoid provoking foreign troops. The war, for Iran, had lasted only a few days, but its consequences were deep and lasting. What followed next would reshape Iran's leadership, redefine its relationship with global powers, and set the stage for new tensions that would continue long after the guns fell silent. The invasion had succeeded militarily, but the occupation and the political transformation it triggered was just beginning. The occupation, a divided Iran under foreign control. When the ceasefire was announced, Iran felt as though it had exhaled after holding its breath for days, yet the air that entered its lungs tasted unfamiliar, heavy, and foreign. The fighting had stopped, but a new reality had begun, one that would reshape daily life in ways few had anticipated. The Anglo-Soviet occupation, imposed with the cold efficiency of wartime strategy, took hold quickly. Within hours of the ceasefire, foreign officers were distributing orders, mapping out control zones, and assigning administrative responsibilities as if they had rehearsed it long before their troops crossed the borders. For ordinary Iranians, the shift was jarring. The country had not been destroyed by war, yet it no longer felt like its own. The division of Iran happened with clinical precision. The Soviets took the north, extending their influence over cities like Tabriz, Rasht, and Mashhad. The British secured the south and the oil-rich southwest, including Ahvaz and the all-important Abadan refinery. Central Iran, including Tehran, became a shared zone where diplomats and military officials moved carefully, aware of each other's presence but determined to avoid unnecessary friction. Though they were allies against Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union did not trust each other. Iran, caught in their uneasy partnership, became a silent witness to the rivalry beneath their cooperation. In the northern towns under Soviet command, residents watched the red-starred vehicles roll through streets usually filled with farmers' carts and shopkeepers arranging goods in narrow bazaars. Soviet officers set up administrative headquarters in large homes, schools, or municipal buildings. Posters in Russian appeared overnight on walls announcing new regulations. Local police were instructed to work alongside Soviet advisors, creating a hybrid authority that confused many citizens. Farmers delivering grain to markets found themselves questioned by soldiers who spoke no Persian, relying on hand gestures and stern expressions to convey instructions. Meanwhile, in the British-controlled South, the atmosphere was different, less ideologically driven but equally assertive. British and Indian officers moved with the confidence of seasoned colonial administrators, familiar with managing territories far from home. They reorganized port operations, tightened security around oil fields, and placed military guards along major roads. Indian troops, many of whom had never imagined being deployed in Iran, patrolled dusty streets with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. Their presence felt less intrusive to some residents, yet still represented an occupation that no one had invited. One of the most dramatic shifts occurred in Tehran, where political tensions swirled like dust over a dry plain. Reza Shah, once the commanding figure of Iranian modernization, found his authority draining away rapidly. The Allies viewed him as unreliable and resistant, a man whose pride made him dangerous to their strategic goals. They insisted that he step aside to ensure smoother cooperation. After days of pressure, both direct and indirect, Reza Shah abdicated, leaving the capital under armed escort, a defeated figure leaving behind a throne he had worked so hard to build. His son, the young Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was elevated to the throne in a ceremony that felt subdued, overshadowed by foreign officers discreetly observing from the sides. The new Shah, barely in his 20s, faced a nation occupied by two great powers, a cabinet uncertain of its future, and a public unsure whether to trust his ability to navigate the storm. He spoke of sovereignty, cooperation, and national dignity, but those words felt symbolic against the backdrop of foreign uniforms filling the streets. With the political transition complete, the occupation settled into rhythm. The Allied forces established supply depots, ammunition caches, and transportation hubs across their zones. The Persian Corridor, the essential supply route to the Soviet front, began operating with impressive speed. Trains loaded with American-made trucks, machinery, canned food, and military equipment streamed northward. Iranian workers, supervised by foreign officers, managed loading docks and railway yards, earning wages but losing control over the very infrastructure they operated. For many, the occupation brought employment; for others, it brought resentment. Daily life adapted to the strange new order. Schools reopened, shops resumed business, and markets regained their familiar bustle. But the presence of foreign troops was impossible to ignore. In cafes, soldiers lined up for tea alongside Iranian customers. On roads, convoys of military trucks made it difficult for farmers to transport crops. At night, searchlights swept across the outskirts of major towns, scanning for saboteurs or unauthorized movements. Curfews were occasionally imposed, especially in areas where tensions ran high. In the Soviet zone, political influence seeped deeper than military control. Soviet officials encouraged local groups to form labor unions, cultural committees, and political clubs aligned with left-wing ideology. Newspapers printing sympathetic articles suddenly appeared, promoting ideas of equality and worker solidarity. Some residents found the rhetoric appealing, especially those long frustrated by economic inequality. Others saw it as another layer of foreign intrusion disguised as community empowerment. In the British zone, the strategy leaned more toward stability than ideological change. British administrators prioritized order, efficiency, and protection of oil production. They repaired damaged infrastructure, funded local projects, and tried to maintain cordial relations with tribal leaders. But their presence still carried the weight of empire. Many Iranians felt uncomfortable with the reminder that British influence had never fully disappeared from the region. Black markets began to flourish as foreign supplies trickled into local hands. Items scarce before the invasion, tinned food, cigarettes, machine parts, fabric, became available at high prices. Some residents profited from the occupation, while others struggled to cope with inflation and shortages. Farmers complained that Allied forces requisitioned their transport animals or bought grain at unreasonably low prices. Taxi drivers enjoyed new business from foreign engineers but faced unpredictable roadblocks and checkpoints. Despite the uneasy calm, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Rumors spread of Soviet agents encouraging separatist sentiments in the north and of British officers pressuring ministers in the south. Tehran, caught between the two, became a stage for diplomatic maneuvering. The young Shah found himself balancing between international expectations and public frustration. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every speech dissected for signs of weakness or defiance. Yet amid the occupation's complexities, one undeniable fact shaped everything: Iran had become indispensable to the Allied war effort. The Persian Corridor was delivering critical supplies that kept Soviet armies fighting. Every passing week made the Allied presence feel more permanent. But as the war advanced and power dynamics shifted, the question grew louder in Iranian households and government halls alike: when the fighting abroad stopped, would the occupiers willingly leave? Or had a temporary mission planted roots that would be difficult to remove? The answer to that question would ignite political struggles, international tensions, and local movements that would define the final phase of occupation and Iran's uncertain journey back to sovereignty. The aftermath and legacy: Iran's uneasy return to sovereignty. When World War II began to shift in favor of the Allied powers, Iran found itself standing in the middle of a quiet but significant transformation. The guns that had burst into the country in 1941 had long fallen silent, yet their echoes lingered throughout every part of Iranian society. The occupation zones still existed, the soldiers still patrolled the roads, and foreign advisors still influenced decisions in cabinet rooms. But by 1944, whispers began to circulate in Tehran's political circles: if the war ended soon, what would become of the foreign troops who had taken root in Iran's soil? Would they pack their bags and leave, or would the war's end open the door to new pressures and rivalries? For many Iranians, the prospect of regaining sovereignty seemed simple on paper but complicated in reality. Britain and the Soviet Union had entered Iran under the justification of wartime necessity. But wars tend to create habits of power, access, and influence. As long as their armies remained, Iran's independence remained suspended, caught between the polite promises of diplomats and the firm boots of soldiers on its streets. And behind those two visible powers stood a new actor: the United States. Though America had not participated in the initial invasion, its logistical presence grew through the operation of the Persian Corridor. U.S. trucks, mechanics, technicians, and administrators became regular sights in southern and central Iran, introducing another layer to the evolving political landscape. By late 1944, Allied victory in Europe seemed inevitable. Battles were still raging, but the German front was shrinking rapidly. In Iranian homes, radios crackled with international broadcasts announcing Allied advances, and newspapers printed reports predicting the fall of Berlin. Amid this global shift, Iranians expected that preparations for a withdrawal would begin. However, in the northern provinces under Soviet control, a different atmosphere prevailed. Soviet officers increased their meetings with local groups, particularly ethnic minorities such as the Azerbaijanis and Kurds. New political organizations emerged almost overnight, advocating regional autonomy and cultural rights. Many Iranians viewed these developments with deep suspicion, wondering whether the Soviets intended to shape a buffer zone on Iranian territory. Meanwhile, the British focus remained largely on securing their strategic interests, primarily oil and transportation. They supported the Iranian government's attempt to maintain order but were cautious about leaving too quickly, worried that instability might disrupt the pipeline of supplies still being transported to the Soviet front. Although the war was winding down, it had not yet ended, and the British argued that the occupation was still essential. Some Iranian officials agreed, others saw this as a delaying tactic. In Tehran, the young Shah navigated these crosswinds with increasing concern. He had inherited the throne under extraordinary circumstances and now stood at the center of competing pressures. On one hand, he needed to preserve good relations with the Allies, whose support guaranteed Iran's survival during the war. On the other, he faced growing public frustration. Ordinary Iranians wanted their country back, not divided by foreign flags, not shaped by outside advisors, and not used as a conduit for other people's battles. Cabinet ministers debated how forcefully the demand for withdrawal should be made. The fear of Soviet retaliation or British disappointment made every discussion feel like walking on a fragile surface that could crack without warning. The political atmosphere grew heavier as 1945 approached. In February, the Yalta Conference brought together Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin to discuss the post-war world. Iran was not the main topic, but the future of occupied territories was. The conference produced promises of cooperation and fair treatment, yet Iran's delegation was not reassured. They had heard promises before, promises that vanished when foreign interests demanded otherwise. Then, in May 1945, Germany surrendered. Cities around the world erupted in celebration, but in Iran the mood was strangely restrained. People were relieved that the war was ending, but the presence of foreign forces dampened any national joy. The question that had been quietly simmering for months now burst into open conversation: the war is over, why are the soldiers still here? Britain hinted at a gradual withdrawal. The United States encouraged the idea of respecting Iranian sovereignty. But the Soviet Union resisted. Their stance was vague but firm: they would leave only when they believed conditions were stable. To many Iranians, this sounded like a polite refusal. The unease grew even stronger when reports surfaced of Soviet-backed political assemblies gaining influence in the north, particularly in Tabriz. Meetings were held in which demands for local autonomy were voiced, sometimes in the presence of Soviet officers. Tehran watched nervously as the situation drifted toward confrontation. By late 1945, tension reached a breaking point. In the Soviet zone, local militias emerged, claiming authority over municipal decisions. The Iranian government tried sending officials to reassert control, but they were stopped or ignored. It became clear that something more than occupation was unfolding, something that threatened Iran's territorial integrity. When a separatist administration was declared in Azerbaijan, backed indirectly by Soviet influence, the crisis became international. Tehran protested fiercely, insisting on its right to govern all its provinces. The British supported Iran's sovereignty, partly because they feared Soviet expansion toward the Middle East. The United States, now emerging as a global power, took an even stronger stand, viewing the situation as a test of post-war principles. The crisis dragged into early 1946, with diplomatic cables flying between capitals. Iran took the bold step of bringing the issue before the newly formed United Nations Security Council, marking one of its first major appeals to an international institution. The Soviets objected, but the pressure mounted. Eventually, after intense negotiations and mounting global scrutiny, Soviet forces agreed to withdraw. Their departure was gradual and, at times, tense, but by spring 1946, their military presence had ended. British forces also began pulling out soon after, completing their withdrawal later that same year. When the last foreign units left Iranian soil, a wave of mixed emotions washed over the country. Relief, pride, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of vulnerability all coexisted. Iran had survived a global war, an occupation, and a near-separatist crisis. But the experience left deep scars: political, psychological, and strategic. The young Shah, having navigated these trials, emerged with greater authority but also with a clearer understanding of how fragile independence could be.